Evercold's reveal is promising bold changes to Final Fantasy XIV in many ways. Among other things, this includes a shift to a main tank/off tank system, compared to the current setup of tanks we have now, where any tank is designed to be able to fill as either main tank or off tank. While we don't currently have much information on what this means for tank jobs moving forward, I still think it would be fun to share some ideas and opinions on what that might look like in the future, while we all eagerly await the new information that will eventually be fed to us later. But first, I'd like to take some time to talk about current tank design and give some of my thoughts as to why they may have decided to make this change in the first place. I will preface this by saying I am by no means a serious tank player. I've at least done my part tanking in a raid tier here and there, and I've dabbled with Dark Knight during some UCOB prog, but this is not my role of choice. Despite that, I'd like to think I still have a solid grasp on what these jobs do, what their functions in a raid are, and that will lead us to why I believe they are making these changes moving forward, and what I'm personally hoping for with them. In modern Final Fantasy XIV raid design, there are two main functions that need to be fulfilled by the party while resolving mechanics. A, the party needs to reduce the boss's HP down to 0. And B, the party needs to ensure that they survive long enough to actually do that. To help us accomplish this goal, jobs are split up into 3 distinct roles: tanks, healers, and DPS. All jobs are responsible for both in their own ways. Healers do need to do damage and DPS do need to mint, but your job's role is meant to help dictate what your primary focus is. So a DPS main's function, of course, is dealing as much damage as possible, while healers are the primary players responsible for keeping the party alive and recovering as things start to go wrong. Tanks kind of exist in this middle ground between both. Tanks have a more demanding damage rotation than healers, though not quite to the extent of DPS, and while their party mitigation skills aren't quite as robust as a healer's, they still have a plethora of defensive skills for both themselves and their party. Now, of course, tanks do have other responsibilities on top of this, things like holding aggro of a boss to prevent it from damaging other players, positioning the boss in fights where it's necessary, as well as handling any tank busters that arise. In some older MMOs, a tank player is also responsible for dungeon pathing, mob pulling, and generally just setting the overall pace of the party itself. We still see this to a degree in dungeons, but elsewhere this is much less of a consideration. The existence of tank stance greatly streamlines the effort of managing enmity, and since raid encounters involve us simply loading directly into a boss arena, tanks don't actually play much of a part in setting the pace of the raid itself besides starting the pull countdown. Boss movement and positioning is still important, of course, but this is only a consideration for the main tank, and many modern raids are either large static bosses that hang over the side of the arena anyways, or simply just reposition themselves in the center during major mechanic casts. Now, this is not to say that tank players don't have responsibilities in raid, because they absolutely do. Boss positioning and aggro management are still very important, and if the boss starts auto-attacking one of your DPS players, that's going to be a problem. But some of these responsibilities aren't very well expanded on in modern fight design, and I think at times that they actually exist at odds with encounters. And this is exacerbated by the lopsided responsibilities between both the main and off tank. Main tank is a much bigger responsibility than off tank, which I think has made them hesitant to expand much further on tank mechanics within a raid. I usually raid with friends, but we still PF pretty often. And in my times PFing, I've seen many players nervous or uncomfortable with the idea of main tanking. Tank players often load into my PFs and ask if it's okay for them to off-tank. And I get it, it's much higher pressure, especially compared to how relatively low pressure off-tanking usually is. In PF environments, you usually just act as a DPS with the extra safety net of having a much higher health pool. This is why I say that tanks as a role sometimes exist at odds with the encounter design itself. Most encounters themselves do not necessitate the existence of 2 tanks. You can usually just get by with a main tank and having everybody else in the party funneling all their healing and mitts into them. To be fair, Week 1 Savage Raids or on-patch ultimates are usually different. Because boss damage is so much tighter, the disparity between a main and off tank starts to kind of blur. Instead, much like healers, you'll usually want to view your mitigation as a shared pool between both tanks, where you're constantly tank swapping and passing aggro back and forth to accommodate for your co-tank's mid cooldowns. And in these types of environments, I think tank function tends to make a lot more sense, but the main tank off tank distinction isn't aimed at challenging this. The issue I think it's trying to address is the PF tank experience, where item level will gradually increase and groups end up much less coordinated. This is where the job of the off tank starts to kind of fall apart a bit. As players get more health and better gear, the damage from the boss becomes less tight, and you can more reliably get by with just the main tank face tanking the whole fight, while your off tank kinda just chills and pops their mitt for the occasional shared tank buster. It kinda just feels like you're there as a safety net in case something goes wrong with the main tank and you need to take aggro. And that's not a bad thing, but I think you could absolutely do a little bit more with the role itself. Compared to the two healers in your party, both healers are always engaging with healing the party and juggling their mitts, not taking turns with it like tanks do with boss aggro for the most part. So then comes the design question. How do we make an off-tank's job more engaging? Well, one of the ways is to expand on their fight design, and we've absolutely had that with some encounters in Arcadian. Mechanics can be designed to ask more interesting questions of their tank players, and I do hope that they continue to do this. But the other part of this is to expand on what the tanks themselves are actually doing. Job homogenization has been a very big talking point in the community for quite a while now. And yeah, I know this is kind of opening that whole can of worms again, but just bear with me for a little bit. I do want to preface this by saying that I don't think streamlining and homogenizing jobs is inherently bad. And I do also think that as time has gone on, a lot of the criticisms surrounding the job changes we've seen have been pretty overblown in a lot of ways. Many of the changes that have been made make sense if you look at them from the context they were designed around. And I do understand their reasoning when it comes to, honestly, most of the tank changes we've received in the last couple of expansions. Despite that, I also believe that tanks are by far the most homogenized role in the entire game. Not every tank plays the exact same, of course, but their rotations have all grown more similar to each other. Like, at this point, Dark Knight is now the only tank that even has a 2-minute DPS cooldown. And I think more drastically, their mid cycles are nearly identical in function, almost across the board. I think a big reason this came about in the first place is because of a pretty noble design goal. They wanted every tank to be able to function well as either a main tank or an off tank. They want you to be able to play any combination of tanks in any encounter. And I mean, yeah, I think of course that's a good thing. But the quote-unquote issue here is that this changed how tanks were evaluated in the game. Suddenly the quote-unquote uniqueness of a tank's mitigation might become a problem. Obviously, a skill like Dark Knight's Dark Mind is extremely strong if you're fighting a boss that has magic auto attacks or magic tank busters. But with the way that tank mit has changed over time, Dark Knight ended up feeling lacking where bosses didn't do magic damage. Before it was changed, a skill like this didn't provide any value to a Dark Knight acting as a main tank, and now this sets them behind compared to the other tanks. They basically just have one less mit skill compared to the others. So it was changed to partially work on physical damage too, along with a handful of other tank skills. Now, just to be clear, I think this was a good change, and it makes sense with the way the game is currently designed. I don't disagree with them doing this, but it's yet another change made to keep all the tanks in line with each other. Similarly, back in Endwalker, every tank besides Dark Knight was given a crazy strong short mid cooldown that could be shared with another target. Dark Knights were given Oblation, which is useful but comparatively much weaker than Bloodwedding, Holy Sheltron, or Heart of Corundum. And the reason this was done is because Dark Knight already has the Blackest Night, and so before Endwalker, no other tank really had an equivalent skill that matched it in terms of mit power. As a result, the other tanks were given powerful short mid cooldowns to put them in line with the precedent that Dark Knight set previously. You might notice that I've brought up Dark Knight a handful of times, and that's because I think Dark Knight has challenged their tank design a lot more than most of the other tanks have. And I think as a result, Dark Knight has kind of had its identity eroded the most. And I mean, I started playing in Shadowbringers, so I'm not even talking about way back when it had Dark Arts. Obviously, the job is currently very strong, and it has been for a long while, but I feel like that spark that kind of makes it unique has sort of been lost at this point. It's most iconic at this point for its extremely strong 2-minute burst window, but I don't know. I just feel like there should be a little bit more to it than that. With Evercold though, it seems like we'll be getting kind of a fresh start. Tanks will be distinguished as main tanks and off tanks. Both Paladin and our mysterious new tank will be main tanks, while Warrior, Gunbreaker, and Dark Knight will now be categorized as off tanks. And first and foremost, I think making this distinction is important. This helps clarify a player's role in the raid, and with their role being more clearly defined, my hope is that we can start designing mechanics with this in mind more confidently. We no longer need to worry about players in a party finder joining a group and having no idea how to main tank because all they've played is off tank. Now you always know what you'll be doing when you queue in. And honestly, I'm feeling pretty optimistic for this. They talked a lot in the first dev showcase how they felt restricted in fight design because of things like the 2-minute buff window. And I think this tank disparity was also kind of a restriction to them. It's like they kind of have to hold back on tank mechanics so players aren't put in situations that they aren't actually prepared for. Now, I'm not expecting anything revolutionary here, but maybe now they can actually experiment more. With a clear definition of what an off-tank is, maybe now we can actually get off-tank mechanics more frequently. Maybe we can pivot their role responsibilities to be different from that of the main tank. Now again, the other part of this is the actual job design itself, and this is what I'm actually the most excited for. I've heard some players concerned that this may only further homogenize tanks into more specific roles, but I just don't really agree with that. Obviously, we'll just have to wait and see when Evercold comes out, but just hear me out here for a little bit. I spoke a bit earlier about how each tank has the same core MIT skills that function nearly identically. I think this was largely done so that any tank would be able to function well as a main tank. I don't need to tell you that main tanks take drastically more damage than off tanks in every single encounter. If you've ever played main tank in a PF group, you know. But if only a handful of our tanks are actually going to be main tanks now, well, then our off tanks don't really need as many of these MIT skills anymore. And this gives them the design space to do something different with them. The one that I am on my hands and knees hoping and praying for is that Evolved Dark Knight will be able to sacrifice its HP for some of its abilities. Whether that's sacrificing its own HP to share with a party member, or sacrificing its health to convert into damage somehow. Because the job is now clearly defined as an off tank, they will be designed with the intention that they will not be taking damage from the boss at all times. And that means we can start using our HP as a resource in different ways. Similarly, Warrior could be granted a more traditional Berserk-style ability, where they deal more damage, but also open themselves up to taking more damage for a duration. An ability like this would have been a headache as a main tank warrior, but as an off tank, there will be more openings for you to use an ability like this without endangering yourself so drastically, or at least without pissing off your healers as much. Gunbreaker I think was originally intended to be an off tank, and I don't know, maybe they could expand on its idea of sharing or duplicating its smaller mitts on a partner, like sharing its shield on its default combo. Maybe they could be given some kind of bodyguard mechanic where they select a target to receive their mitts in their place, or maybe they could just put even more of an emphasis on their actual damage rotation, as they won't need to worry about positioning the boss or mitigating as much. Okay, obviously I'm just spitballing random ideas here, but some of this sounds kind of fun to me. Many tanks and games often have some layer of risk versus reward in their playstyle, and I think this is something that has grown to be sorely lacking in current tank design. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with having this strong core of defensive cooldowns that you rotate through. That's absolutely a core MMO tank identity, and it should stay. but I don't think literally every tank in the game needs to be like that. Another thing to keep in mind too is the fact that we are still going to be able to play as the Reborn jobs if we so choose. And unless they make specific and probably significant changes there shouldn't really be any issue having a Reborn Warrior, Gunbreaker, or Dark Knight as your main tank if you really want to. I think one of the bigger concerns players have here is that we're only actually getting 2 options as our main tanks, but if you throw the Reborn jobs back into the mix, I think we're going to have plenty of healthy options. At least, that's my hope. We'll just kind of have to wait and see what they do, but I'm actually pretty hopeful that this will help push tank identity in a healthier direction. And again, we will have the Reborn modes to fall back on, at which point the distinction between main versus off tank might not even matter anymore. We still have a lot to learn about what Evercold is going to bring to Final Fantasy XIV, and as such, we will all be awaiting the next couple of Fanfests eagerly with bated breath. But as I said in one of my last videos touching on this, I'm more excited than I think I've ever been for this game. What we're seeing is actually something new and fresh, and I think that's exciting. I'm hoping that the Fanfest in Berlin will show off one of our off-tanks specifically, as we only have a tiny bit of Paladin footage to really be going off of for now, but of course we're going to see many more changes by the time the expansion actually releases in full. Anyways, that's all I got for this one, so thanks for watching.